Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at solving quadratic equations for your GCSE maths. Now we have lots and lots of examples here at 3 different levels worked through at a slow pace. So what I want you to do is to pick the level that you feel is appropriate for you, watch the first example, watch how the answer is worked out, and then have a go at the second one yourself. If you find that too hard, jump to the easier questions. If you find that too easy, jump to the harder questions. There is nobody watching you, there is nobody pressuring you. Do this at your own pace.
We're going to have a look at solving quadratic equations. Now this is very similar to factorising quadratic equations. The questions look the same except they've got an equals 0 on the end. I'm going to start off with just using our factorising quadratic equations methods. So I'm going to kind of go through these quickly. And if you want more detail on how to factorise, go and watch the video on factorising quadratic equations. So a quick recap on factorising. We need two numbers which multiply together to make 9, but they add together to make 6. And the way to do that is to look at the factors of the number you're multiplying. So for 9, let's do a little bit of working out. We're going to write a list of factors for 9, and the way to generate it is to divide it by every number. So 9 divided by 1 gives us 9. 9 divided by 2 doesn't give us a whole number, so we'll skip by that. 9 divided by 3 gives us 3. And when we repeat a number, so we just get 3 twice there, 3 times 3 is 9, then we can finish our factor list. So we know there are 3 factors for 9. So now we are going to create some double brackets, and we need to think about which numbers are going to go into these double brackets, and then these should multiply out to make our original equation, x squared plus 6x plus 9. So which two of our factors will add together to make 6? Well, 1 and 9 are going to make 10, that won't work, but 3 and 3 will make 6, so we can use that. And you're allowed to repeat numbers, but only if it multiplies by itself to give the original number. So example, 3 times 3 gives us 9, so we're allowed to use 3 twice. But 1 times 1 doesn't give 9, so we can't use 1 twice. Now, so far we've factorised, and we've done this before, but the key thing here now is that this is equal to 0, and now we have to solve it. So to solve an equation, we want to write x is equal to a number. Now, normally we follow quite a few steps to go through this. You might be thinking, oh, I need to expand the brackets back. What do I do? Well, we can use a little trick here, and it's because it's equal to 0. And we exploit the fact that any number multiplied by 0 equals 0. So to find what x equals, all we have to do is find a number that will make one of the brackets equal to 0. So look at the first bracket, we've got x plus 3. So what value can x take to make that bracket be 0? So what will join up with a positive 3 to make 0? Well, a negative 3 will do that. And now if we read the first bracket, it would read negative 3 plus 3, which is 0. And so if that first bracket is 0, it's been multiplied by the second bracket, and no matter what that second bracket is, any number times 0 is 0. So moving on to question 2, we can use the same process. We're going to have double brackets, we're going to factorise, and we need to find out what numbers go into those double brackets. So looking at original expression, x squared minus 12x plus 36, we're going to look at the factors of that final number, the number we're trying to multiply to get. So let's look at 36. So to find the factors, we're going to divide it by every number. Divide it by 1, divide it by 2, divide it by 3, divide it by 4. We can't divide by 5 and get a whole number, so we'll skip that. And we can divide by 6, which will give us 6, and because we're repeating a number, 6 times 6 is 36, we have finished our factor list for 36. So now we need to think, right, which of those numbers, which pair of numbers will give us the negative 12? So 1 and 36, if we take them away, we're going to get 35, that's not going to work. 2 and 18, maybe that would give us 16, that's not going to work. 3 and 12, we take them away, we get 9, and we add them, we get 15. That's not going to work. Then looking at the 4 and 9, they can subtract to make 5, they can add to make 13. That's not going to work. And the 6, a 6 and a 6 will make 12, so it looks like 6 is going to be the factor we're looking at. And we can use it twice because 6 times 6 is 36. So 6 times 6 is 36, let's put that in. Now it's actually negative 12. What we are allowed to do is use a negative version of these numbers. A negative 6 will give us negative 12. They might be thinking, well, how do we get a positive 36 above negative? Well, a negative multiplied by another negative will give us a positive. Negative 6 times negative 6 will give us a positive 36. So now to solve it, if it's equal to 0, we want to make one of the brackets equal to 0. So if x was 6, the first bracket would read 6 take away 6 is 0. Now we don't need to worry about the second bracket. It's been multiplied by 0, we're going to get a 0. Now, looking at question 3, it looks a little bit different because there's less numbers in the equation. So you're expecting the x squared term, you're expecting a number term, and you're expecting the equal 0. But what we're expecting, and we're missing it, is that x term in the middle, which the first two questions do have. Now, there is an x term in the middle. It's simply that. It's not that, so it must be 0 lots of x. So we can write it in the same format as the other questions. And that means we want two numbers which multiply to give us a negative 36, but they add to give us 0. So we can set up our double brackets. We've already got the factor list for 36 for the last question, so we need to think which of these numbers could possibly give us 0. Now again, it's going to be the 6 at the end and the two 6s. And the way this works is, how can we get a 0 from two 6s? Well, you can add a 6 and subtract a 6. And altogether, that will give us a 0. Then you're out thinking, well, are we going to get the negative 36? Well, a positive 6 multiplied by a negative 6. 6 times 6 is 36, and a positive multiplied by a negative will give us a negative. So that's going to work out for us. Then as the same last step, we want to make it equal to 0, and that first bracket, if it was equal to negative 6, it would read negative 6 plus 6 is 0. So we've got an answer. However, for this question, you'll notice the terms in the two brackets are different. In the first question, they're both positive 3. In the second question, they're both a negative 6. But in this one, we've got the positive 6 and the negative 6, and they're both going to give us different answers. So in the second bracket, if the x was 6, just like in the last question, the second bracket would read 6 take away 6 is 0. And now because that second bracket is 0, no matter what the first bracket gives us, we're going to be getting 0. So there's actually two answers. Now we'll look through this in a little bit more detail. Let's have a look at what actually happens with this substitution. So I'm going to write this out again, but we're going to follow the first answer. So instead of writing x, I'm going to write negative 6. But I'm also going to substitute that into the second bracket. Instead of x, we've got negative 6. So if we look at this, the first bracket, negative 6 plus 6 is 0. You've got two brackets next to each other being multiplied. And in the second bracket, negative 6 take away another 6 is negative 12. So we're saying that 0 times negative 12 is 0. And it is. Anything multiplied by 0 is going to give us 0. So just so you can see kind of how this is working out. Let's do the same thing for the second answer. So I'm going to get rid of the x's and get rid of the answers. Again, let's replace with a second substitution. So we're saying that for the second answer, x is 6. So we're replacing the x's with 6's. So our first bracket, 6 plus 6 is 12. And our second bracket, 6 take away 6 is 0. So we're saying that 12 times 0 equals 0. And again, you don't need to do the substitution every single time. I'm just showing you that so you understand why we're trying to make it equal 0, because we're going to be multiplying by 0 no matter what the other bracket is. Moving on to question 4, and again, we have a question where it's got the x squared term we're expecting, it's got the number term we're expecting, which is negative 49 in this case, and we've got the equal 0. We don't have that middle x term, so again, it must be 0. So now we're going to think what two numbers multiply together to make 49, but they add together to give 0. Now, I'm not going to do the factor list this time, because you might have spotted what's happening here. It's all about square numbers. If you have a square number and one's positive and one's negative, the middle term is always going to be 0. But what square number is 49? It's 7 squared. So 7 is going to go in the brackets, 1 being positive and 1 being negative. And again, it's equal to 0, which gives us two possible answers. To make the first bracket be 0, x would have to be negative 7. And to make the second bracket be 0, x would have to be 7. So it doesn't matter what value x has, either one of those two values will give you the correct answer of 0. There's two different ways of getting the answer. So then for the final question, again we have a term missing, so it must be 0. Because we have that 0 in the middle, I'm looking for square numbers. And is 1 a square number? Yes, it is. 1 times 1 equals 1. And that's something that can just confuse a lot of students. So we're going to have a positive 1 and a negative 1. A positive 1 take away 1 will give us 0. And multiplying them, a positive 1 times a negative 1, 1 times 1 is 1. But a positive and a negative gives us a negative. So that works. Then make it be equal to 0. So the first bracket will be 0 if x was negative 1. And the second bracket will be 0 if x was equal to a positive 1. Again, we've got our two answers. And so when you're solving quadratic equations, you are always going to have two answers. And looking at question 1 and 2, I guess they do have two answers in a way. It's just for question 1, both answers are negative 3. And for question 2, both answers are positive 6. So you can get one answer if you have the same number in both brackets, but usually you'll be getting two answers. And it is actually possible to get 0 answers, but that's something we'll cover in a later video when we look at the graphs. So let's do some practical questions. So for each one of these, we're going to factorise, meaning we want two numbers which multiply to give 15 and add to give 8 for the first question. We're going to set up our double brackets. And to factorise, we're going to look at the factors of 15 first. So let's divide it by all the numbers. 15 divided by 1. We can't divide by 2. We can divide it by 3. We can't divide by 4. We can divide by 5, but we've already got 5, so we're repeating ourselves. We have finished our factor list. Now our middle term is 8, so which one of these numbers will give us 8? Well, 3 and 5 will give us 8. So let's write in the 3 and the 5, and they're both positive. So then making that equal to 0, again this being the extra step for this topic, to make the first bracket be 0, x would have to be negative 3. And to make the second bracket be 0, x would need to be negative 5. So you might be noticing now that the answers are always a number in the bracket, but you're flipping the sign around. Moving on to question 2, set up the brackets. We'll look at the factors of 16, that second number. So divide it by 1, divide it by 2, can't divide it by 3, and we can divide it by 4. Now we need to see which ones of those are going to give us the 10. So I think the 2 and 8 are going to give us 10. So we put the 2 and the 8 into the brackets. Make it equal 0. So we're just going to take the numbers in the brackets. Positive 2 will be negative 2, and a positive 8 will be a negative 8. So we're just flipping the signs. Same thing for question 3. Set up the brackets. Look at the factors. So what the factors of 6. Divide by 1. Divide by 2. And then we can divide by 3. We've already got 3. We're repeating ourselves. We've finished. Now our middle term is 1x. So which numbers are going to give us 1? Now 1 and 6 give 7. 2 and 3 is 5. But we are allowed to do takeaways as well. So 6 and 1 might give us 5 as a takeaway. And the 2 and 3, 3 take away 2 will give us 1. So we want to put the 2 and 3 in. Be careful with the signs. To get a positive 1, it's going to be a positive 3 take away 2 to get the positive 1. Then just double check how we get a negative 6. Well, 3 times negative 2 will give us negative 6. That works. And for the answers, take the sign and flip it. Positive 3 becomes negative 3. Negative 2 becomes a positive 2. If you get why we're doing this, again, you're making the brackets be equal to 0. Negative 3 plus 3 is 0. 2 take away 2 is 0. Moving on to question 4, we are looking at the factors of 24. Divide by 1, divide by 2, divide by 3, divide by 4. We can't divide by 5 and get a whole number, so we'll skip 5. And we can divide by 6. We've already got the 6, so we know we've finished our list. Now we want to get a negative 2. So which ones of these could possibly give us a 2? Probably going to be a takeaway. So looking through the list, it looks like 6 takeaway, 4 would give us 2. But then we've got to be very, very careful with the signs here. It's a negative 2x in the middle. We want a negative 2. So it would actually be a positive 4 take away 6 to give us a negative 2. So again, very, very careful with the signs. Then our answers, plot the signs, -4 and +6. And moving on to our last practice question here, we want the factors of 18. We can divide by 1, we can divide by 2, we can divide by 3. 4 and 5 won't give us whole numbers, and we can divide by 6, which we've already got, so we know we've finished our list. You want to try and get a 7 out of this. Now to get a 7, I think it's going to be the 9 and the 2 can give us 7 by taken away. But before we write 9 and 2 in, we're very careful with the signs. It's actually -7. So to get a negative number, the smaller number will be positive, and the larger number will be negative. Test it out. 2 take away 9 is -7. And then we can write our final answers, and very important to do this, you will lose a mark if you don't. -2 and a +9. Now, moving on to the hard questions, there's a few more things to think about. So for the first question, we can set up our brackets with our x in each. But the extra thing here is we put the x's in the brackets always because the x multiplied by x gives us the x squared term. And in the easy medium questions, it was 1x squared. So you want 1x times 1x. Now for this question, it's actually a 3x squared. So one of the x's will have to have a 3 on it. And if you multiply this bracket out, you'll have the 3x multiplied by the x will give us 3x squared. So the first complication is putting in the kind of coefficient for the x squared into your brackets. And the next thing is, we want to carry on the same way. We want two numbers which multiply to give us a 5 and add to give us the 8. And we're going to look at the factors of 5. So we can divide it by 1. 2, 3, and 4 are not going to give us a whole number. And we can divide it by 5. Repeating ourselves, we've finished the list. 5 is a prime number, we've only got 2 factors. So then we're looking for two numbers which are adding together to give us the 8. And we only have one option, 1 and 5. And 1 and 5 do not give us the 8. So how does this work? So again, if you want more help with this, go and watch the video on factorising quadratic equations. But a quick recap is, when you're multiplying this out, you'll be multiplying one of the number terms by the 3x. So we're allowed to multiply one of the numbers by 3. So we can multiply the 1 by 3, which will give us 3 and 5. Or we can multiply the 5 by the 3, which will give us 1 and 15. And now we can see how we get the 8. It's the 3 and 5 are going to give us the 8. Now we don't write the 3 and 5 in, we're going to write in 1 and 5. So where does the 3 come from? The 3 is when we multiply the 3x term by the term pointing up with the arrow. So that number has to be the 1. And it's going to be multiplied by the 3 to give us 3. Then the 5 is going to be in the other bracket. And that 5 is going to be multiplied by the x to give us 5x. And if you just draw on the arrows for how you multiply out double brackets, so you multiply in this kind of pattern, you'll see the 3x is only multiplying the numbers in the second bracket. So if you want something to be multiplied up, it's going to go in the opposite bracket to the number that's multiplying it. So that was our second complication of these questions, and there's a third thing to look at. So when we say equal to 0, we want to make the brackets equal to 0. The second bracket is pretty easy. It was -1 plus 1 would get us 0. So following the rules for the previous questions, we're just flipping the sign on the number. But it's a bit more complicated when we look at the 3x plus 5. Now you might be tempted to write, well, x is going to be equal to -5. And if we did that, we'd have 3 multiplied by -5 plus 5. That's going to give us -15 plus 5, which is -10. It isn't given a 0. So when you have that extra coefficient on the x in the bracket, you can't just flip the sign. It's not going to work. What we need to do is take that 3 into account. So we're going to want the bracket 3x plus 5 to equal 0. We can solve this equation. We can take away 5 from both sides. And then we can divide both sides by 3. And so x is going to be -5 thirds. And that is to do what we did before and say x is going to be the number with the flip side, so the -5, but divide it by the coefficient on the x. The x has got 3 on it, so we're dividing the -5 by 3. So trying that again with question 2. Set up the bracket. We have a 3 on the x squared, so we need a 3x in one of the brackets. We want the factors of 40, so divide 40 by 1, divide it by 2, Can't divide it by 3 to get a whole number. You can divide by 4. You can divide by 5. We can't divide by 6 or 7 to get a whole number, but we can divide by 8. We've already got it though, so we know we've finished our list. We want to get a 7 out of these numbers. And again, none of these are going to give you a 7, but you are allowed to multiply one of the numbers by 3. So we could have 3 and 40. We could have 1 and 120, which obviously is going to get nowhere near. We could have 6 and 20. They also have to give 14, so that's still too far away. And yeah, we could multiply 20 by 3 and get 2 and 60. That'll be nowhere near. The 4 and 10. Multiply the 4 by 3, that'll give us 12 and 10. So that'll give us a 2, that's not a 7. Or you can multiply the 10 by the 3, and that'll give you 4 and 30, which again, it's not going to get a 7. Then the 5 and 8, you can multiply the 5 by the 3 to get us 15. So 15 and 8. Or we can multiply the 8 by the 3, give us 5 and 24. So which ones are going to give us a 7? So if you look at this really carefully, I think 15 take away 8 is going to give us the 7. So we don't write in 15 and 8, we write in the original numbers, the 5 and the 8. And because that 5 was multiplied by 3, it has to go in the opposite bracket to the 3x. And 8 in the same bracket. Then think about positive and negative numbers. Well, we want to get a positive 7x, and it was 15 take away 8. Since a 5 is how we get the 15, it's going to be a negative 5, and then a positive 8. Then we make it be equal to 0. And when we're writing this in, if it's just x on its own, then just flip the sign as usual. X could be a positive 5. But we've got a coefficient on the x, then what we do is we do flip the sign with the 8, so it gives a negative 8, but we're going to divide it by the coefficient on the x. We're going to divide it by 3. So x would be negative 8/3. And if you like, you could turn that into a mixed number. So that would be 2 and 2/3, negative 2 and 2/3. But unless the exam tells you specifically to write it in a certain format, then leaving it as a top-heavy fraction is going to be fine. Moving on to question 3. So again, set up your brackets. This time we have a 2 on the x squared. So we need a 2 on the x in the brackets. We want to look at the factors of 48. So divide it by 1, divide it by 2, divide it by 3, divide it by 4. We're not going to be able to divide it by 5, but we can divide it by 6. We can't divide by 7, and we've already divided by 8, so we know we've finished our list of factors. Now we're trying to get a negative 22, and although one of these will give us a 22, the 2 and the 24 will give us 22. You have to remember one of them has to be multiplied by 2. So even though that 2 and 24 will do the job for us, because when we multiply by 2, it will make the calculation be wrong, so we can't use that. Now, a little clue is because the 48 is positive, but the middle term's negative, it must be a negative multiplied by a negative. So we're going to be subtracting both numbers from each other. So even with that, the 2 and the 24, they'd have to be subtracted, which you get as a negative 26. So that's not going to work no matter what. I might even look at alternatives for the terms with 48 and 24 in, those factors, because it's going to be too big multiplying them. They're too far away from 22. So let's concentrate on the other options. So let's look at the 3 and the 16. So we multiply one of them by 2. You could have 6 and 16. Or we could have 3 and 32. Then for the 4 and 12, one of them has to be multiplied by 2. We could have 8, 12. Or we could have 4 and 24. And then for the 6 and 8, multiply the first one by 12 and multiply the second one by 2. So remembering we're subtracting both, which ones are going to give us a negative 22? So 12 and 8 will give us 20, 4 and 24 will give us 28, 8 and 12 is 20, 3 and 32 is 35. So as I mentioned, the first options were too big anyway. And 6 and 16, they will subtract to give us negative 22. And we've got two different options. So actually we need to be using both in our answers. So let's set up a second set of brackets for the alternate set of answers. So looking at the 6 and 8 first, it was the 8 that we multiplied by 2. So it's the 8 that has to go in the opposite bracket to the 2. So then the 6 would go in the bracket with the 2x. With the other set, 6 and 16, we multiply the 3 by 2. So the 3 has to go in the opposite bracket to 2x. And then 16 can be in the same bracket. So then when the first option is equal to 0, x would be 8, and x would also be 6 over 2. And if x is equal to 6 over 2, 6 divided by 2 is 3. So we can say that x will be equal to 3. For the second set of brackets, we can say x is equal to 3 to the second bracket, again to make that equal to 0. And the first bracket, x would be equal to 16 over 2. And 16 divided by 2 is 8. So interestingly, looking at both options, we're getting the same answers. X is equal to 3 and x is equal to 8. So if you do get an option of which factors to look at, it might just be you get the same answer either way. Now, moving on to question 4, we have another complication, and that is that when we set up the brackets for 6x squared, we could have 6x in one bracket and x in the other bracket, and they all multiply together to give us a 6x squared. The problem is there's an alternative, and instead you could have 3x multiplied by 2x, and that will also give you 6x squared. So just be aware there's two different alternatives. This will be important when we look at the factors. Now for the factors, we want to get in a 1. So what are the factors of 1? Well, 1 is 1 times 1. There's only one factor. There's only one choice. So we can just write in the 1s, and we can write in the 1s in all the alternatives. Now you've got to be thinking, okay, 1 times 1 is 1, that's fine, but how are we getting -1 for the middle term? Especially considering that the 6x term is multiplying one of the 1s. So when we say, you have to do the multiplication, then it's going to be 1 times 6, it'll just give us 6. So we have 6 and 1. So that's going to give us 5. It's not going to give us -1 for the middle term. So it's going to be that the alternative with the 6x and the 1x is not going to work for us. Now, what about the second alternative with the 3 and the 2? Well, we're going to be multiplying the 1 by both of those. So 1 times 3 and 1 times 2. And 3 and 2 can give us -1. It would be a -3 and a +2. So the largest one has to be negative, and the largest one is the one that will be multiplied by 3 in the opposite bracket to the 3. So we're going to write it that way around. So it's a little bit confusing, but we're just writing out all of the possibilities. If the coefficient on the x squared has multiple factors, then there might be multiple brackets to look at. And just kind of look at each option one at a time until you get to numbers that you want. +1 times -1 will give us -1 for the final term. If you add them together, considering they get multiplied by the 3 and the 2, we're going to have a +2 take away 3, which gives us a -1 for the middle term. So it all works out. Then we think about it being equal to 0. So for our first bracket, x would be the 1, but we're going to divide it by the coefficient 3. And the second one, the same thing. X is 1, but we have to divide it by the coefficient on the x, which is the 2. Then think about positive and negative numbers. We have a positive number in the bracket for the first bracket, so our answer must be negative to cancel it out. For the second bracket has a -1 in there, so the answer must be a positive to cancel it out. So overall, x is equal to -1/3, and x is equal to a +1/2. Moving on to the final question, and again, we have some options. To get the 4x squared, we could have 4x and 1x, or we could have 2x and 2x. We could test our factors by both different sets. We're looking at the factors of 49, so we can divide it by 1. And 49 is a square number, so it's only going to have another factor, and it's going to be 7. 7 times 7 is 49. Now, the middle term is 0. And no matter what we multiply that 1 by the 4 or the 2, we're getting nowhere near 49. So it must be that we're looking at the 7. So let's write in the 7s. And then remember, we are forced to multiply the 7 by the coefficients on the x. Now, in the first alternative, if you multiply 1 7 by 4 and 1 by 1, they're going to become different numbers, and so they're not going to cancel out to make 0. So the first alternative can't be right. In the second alternative, both of the 7s are being multiplied by 2 to give us 14. And if we had a positive 14 and a negative 14, that's going to give us that 0 for the middle term. So we've got our answer. Then if it's equal to 0, x would be equal to, and again it's the number divided by the coefficient on the x. For both, we've got the same number, but the first one's positive, so the answer has to be negative, and the second one is negative, so the answer has to be positive. So x is equal to negative 7 over 2, or you can write negative 3.5 if you like, or 3.5, and x is equal to 7 over 2. So that would be a positive 3.5 or a positive 3.5. Any answer would do. But again, if you're not sure what format to try your answer in, just read through the question carefully. Look for something that says, write the answer as a mixed number, write it as a top-heavy fraction, or write it as a decimal.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.